What sort of life would you have to have so that you could bear your suffering nobly? That's a good question to ask yourself. Now, and so we had people just write for 15 minutes. If you could have what you wanted and needed, what might that look like? And there's an instruction there too, is do it badly. Because what the hell do you know? And besides, your vision's going to change as you progress through your life. And so you're not going to get it done perfectly, but that's okay. Get it down. Get a rough first draft down, right? A rough approximation of who you could be if you got your act together. Not who other people think you should be, you know? Although that might enter into it because you don't want to be completely you can't be who you are properly and ignore the fact that you're embedded in a social context. And so you have to take the fact that there are other people into account. And it doesn't mean be who your parents think you should be either, even though that's another source of information that you might want to consider. It's a deeper question. It's like, what would actually motivate you? And you might think, well, I could never have that. It's like, that's not the question that's being addressed here. Although I would say, there's no sense floating off into some kind of impossible juvenile fantasy. And we're making an assumption that you're taking the question seriously and that you're going to remain within the bounds of what you regard as sanely reasonable. So that's the first part. The second part was the opposite of that. It's like, okay, now you've specified a goal, where the goal is, in some sense, both your character and your life. And you've specified that rather vaguely. You only had 15 minutes to write about it. And that's a good thing, because now you have something to move toward. Now, I could tell you this technically. This is an interesting thing to know. People say they want to be happy. That's not true, by the way. If you investigate what people mean when they say they want to be happy, they say, I just want to be happy. It's a very funny phrase. It's, what do you mean, just? Like, there isn't anything harder than that. So you can't just say just, that's all you want. You just want to be happy all the time. That's all it would take. It's like, good luck with that. That's not going to happen. So you can get rid of the just. And then, I want to be happy. Well, maybe. Actually, what people really mean when they say that is they don't want to suffer and be miserable. So really what they mean is they don't want to experience excess negative emotion. And you can find that out if you carefully question people and carefully analyze the answers. You find out they're actually more concerned about avoiding the catastrophic negative than living in a world of hedonistic delight. Now, you also find that while avoiding the catastrophic tragedy, they wouldn't mind having a little bit of hedonistic delight. And so some happiness is interleaved in there. Then you might ask yourself, to the degree that people do want hedonistic delight when they're being happy, what does happy mean? And you might think, well, happy means getting what you want. Happy is how you feel after Christmas dinner. It's like, no, that's asleep, right? That's content and asleep. Now, that's a form of contentment, but it isn't really what people mean when they say that they want to be happy. The happiness that people refer to when they talk about happiness has more to do with enthusiasm. And enthusiasm is an interesting word because it means, it's entheos. It means to be inspired. Inspired is in spirit. It means to be imbued with the Spirit. Well, enthusiastic is to be imbued with the Spirit of God, interestingly enough. And we'll return to that. When do you experience the positive emotion that's associated with happiness? The answer is, not when you've attained a goal, but when you're pursuing one. So you're set up, your positive emotion is associated with movement forward. you could say that your positive emotion is the psychological equivalent of forward movement, just as your negative emotion is the psychological equivalent of freezing or retreating. And so your emotions are very tightly tied to your action. Freeze, retreat, negative. Advance towards a goal, positive. No goal, no positive emotion. Now, if you don't remember anything else from tonight, that's a good thing to remember. No goal, no positive emotion. A corollary of that as well is no goal, confusion. So no goal not only means no positive emotion, it also means confusion, and confusion means anxiety and dread. And so a life without a goal is confusing and hopeless. And that begs the question, what should the goal be? And that's partly what we're trying to establish. You wrote for 15 minutes, you try to develop a vision for your life. Now you have something to move toward. That sets up the precondition for potential positive emotion and happiness. What else do you need to motivate you? Well, how about negative emotion? So what do you do with that? Well, negative emotion can stop you. You might think, well, I'd like to get a better job, but I'm afraid of putting myself out in the job market. I'm afraid of being evaluated. I'm afraid that if I tried something more difficult, I might fail. Then you have your negative emotion opposing you, right? It's anxiety is stopping you. And fair enough, because there are things to be anxious about. But what if you could get your negative emotion behind you, pushing you instead of stopping you? Sometimes in my clinical practice, I would have clients who hated their job. They're laboring under the thumb of a tyrant. And maybe that was partly because they'd turned themselves into slaves, but it didn't matter. They were laboring under the thumb of a tyrant, and they needed to make a move, laterally or up. They needed to make a move. And they were often afraid to, and they had their reasons. They didn't want to contemplate their resumes. They didn't want to open up their CVs. They didn't want to face the inadequacies of their past. They were afraid of being evaluated. They were afraid of being rejected. They didn't know how to negotiate. They didn't know how to conduct themselves in an interview. They were afraid of losing the security they'd already built up. They had their fears, and they were real, and those fears stopped them. But they'd come to me and say, oh my God, you know, I'm so miserable. My life is so miserable. And we'd take that apart. And one of the reasons was because they were laboring under the thumb of a tyrant. And then we'd talk that through, and they'd say, well, I'm afraid to make a change. And I'd say, well, that's okay. That's understandable. How afraid are you of not making a change? Let's make a little vision of that. You're 35, you hate your job. What's the consequence? You're not motivated. You don't want to get out of bed in the morning. You're starting to get depressed. You're getting bitter. You're getting resentful. You're getting cynical. You're amotivated at work. You're not doing a very good job. And you're starting to shrink. Now play that out for 10 years. You don't change it. You don't fix it. And what happens? Well, it's not like it's going to get better of its own accord. What's going to happen to you? Well, for sure, at minimum, what's going to happen to you is you're going to be in the same situation, but 10 years older. And if you can't get out of that situation now, what the hell makes you think you're going to get out of it in 10 years? You're 10 years older, you're 10 years more bitter, you're 10 years more cynical. Maybe by that time your marriage has collapsed because who the hell wants to live with you? You're even more of a slave than you were because you've labored another 10 years under the thumb of the tyrant and stepped backwards every time you were asked to, so you got smaller and smaller as the tyrant got bigger and bigger. It's like, think about that, and that means imagine it. Imagine that, okay? Now that's the situation. You're stuck where you are, but it's 10 years from now. And when I say think of that, I mean imagine that. It's like really play it out. It's like, you know how miserable you are now? You're afraid of making the necessary changes, but you know how miserable you are now. Just imagine how miserable you could be in 10 years. And in all likelihood, what you'll find is that you're way more afraid of that than you are of whatever's stopping you in the present. It's really useful to know what your own particular brand of hell might be. And so one of the things we do in this writing exercise is have people do the reverse. It's like, okay, so imagine now, 5 years from now, you've let whatever temptations you're particularly susceptible to have the upper hand. And they've augured you into the ground. You know, one person's an alcoholic, another person's a criminal, another person's living on the street, someone else is like skirting the edges of prostitution, somebody else is narcissistic and bitter, somebody else is depressed and anxious. You know where you would fall off the edge of the earth if you fell off in whatever direction you're prone to fall off. Everyone knows that, but we avoid that. You know, that's rule 3. Do not hide things in the fog. Is that the rule? Do not hide unwanted things in the fog. Yeah, well, we often won't allow ourselves to imagine the catastrophe that we're pursuing, let's say through inaction. That's a good thing to fix. So now you say, well, you think for 15 minutes, that's not very long, about who you could be and what you could have if you could have what you wanted, if you were who you could be. And then you think about what sort of hell you could produce for yourself if you didn't do that. And that's not a bad polarity. It's like, I'm going to get away from that and I'm going to move towards that. And then you have your negative emotion working for you and your positive emotion working for you. And that's a good gradient, and that's a great gradient emotionally, because as I said, you don't experience positive emotion except in relationship to a goal. And if you got a nice gradient on your goal pursuit, then that's going to increase the degree to which you feel positive emotion. And positive emotion, by the way, isn't just about being happy. That's the most trivial part of it in some sense. Positive emotion allows you to focus. It's the soul of concentration. It's the essence of enthusiastic motivation. When you say, I really want to do that, that statement is predicated on the existence of positive emotion. It's the fact that the goal beckons to you that makes you say, I want to do that. And you know how much easier it is to do something you want to do than to do something you don't want to do. And that ease is actually a consequence of the activation of the system that governs positive emotion. And you might ask yourself, well, how powerful a system is that? And I would say, well, almost all of the drugs of abuse that people are most prone to abusing are abused because they activate the positive emotion system. So cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin is also a painkiller, but it has a psychomotor stimulant element. That's the technical term for the pharmacological effect of pharmacological agents on the positive emotion system. Psychomotor stimulation, psychomotor because it's associated with movement forward. Cocaine is such a powerful drug because it makes you feel like you're doing something worthwhile. That's the system it hyperactivates. And so it's a primary system of motivation. It's as old as forward movement itself. It's a cardinal source of meaning, and it only manifests itself in relationship to a goal.
Where do you find the hope and the strength to continue to fight, or for those who are listening, to get the motivation to stand up and say what's on their mind?
Well, people have to have a dialogue with their own conscience. You know, if you don't imagine that you get upset with something when you recognize an obstacle in your path, and then imagine that you need a path and that you've chosen reasonably wisely, let's say, not perfectly, but reasonably wisely. An obstacle arises, you're frustrated, disappointed, ashamed, afraid. Well, you have something to do to clear out the obstacle. You have something to say. Well, then you don't clear out the obstacle because you're afraid to speak or you're unwilling to speak. You want to defer the conflict because you hope it will go away. All that'll happen is that the obstacles will pile up. But then your life will be nothing but obstacles. Well, you need to know that. You have to ask yourself if you believe that's true. If it's true, then you don't want to remain silent. Imagine too that as you remain silent, you get smaller because you're not manifesting the courage necessary to live by your own standards. And the problem gets bigger. Well, if you're not going to speak now, what makes you think you're going to be more prepared in the future?
You won't.
Why is that going to happen? When does that ever happen?
Well, I can't believe we're talking about school. People who say, just stay quiet in school, just get the grade. That's
paying
wrong. Them.
That's wrong.
That's right. You're paying them. You don't have the courage when you're paying. When somebody's paying you and they're doing something at work and they want you to play along, you think you're going to have courage then? I mean, you've got to face it
I told
as
my
it
students
happens.
all the time to never write something they didn't believe to be true. And I know this as a psychologist too. You might think, I can get away with writing out something I don't believe for the grade and all, but there are studies of this sort of phenomenon. So imagine you have a viewpoint, and I measure that with a political attitudes questionnaire. Okay, maybe it's a viewpoint. What do we take? You're anti-immigration, just for the sake of argument. And then I ask you to write out a 500-word pro-immigration essay. And then a week later, I give you the political questionnaire again. Now, I'm going to bury it in a bunch of other questionnaires, so you don't know what I'm measuring. Okay, Your belief has tilted way towards the argument that you've made, even though you don't know it. So, and it's because most of your beliefs are actually rather shallow in terms of their explicit formulation. You think you believe something, but it's pretty shallow. It's just an assumption. Now, you might act on it and all of that, but it's not well differentiated and articulated. Now, if you take one of your assumptions and you write a counterexample, you're going to articulate that. Well, then that's going to move you. And so if you think that you can write an essay that you don't believe and you'll remain unscathed by that, well, you're wrong. You won't. And if you do it 20 times, you will turn into what you wrote. That's what will happen. And it's an absolute sin in my estimation. I mean that specifically for anyone who attends university to write what they do not believe to be true. It's certainly a sin for anyone to encourage them to do that. Now, you can do that as an exercise. You can ask people to delineate out an argument that runs contrary to their viewpoint. That can be part of the reasonable process of learning.
Correct.
But that is not the same thing as doing it for deceptive purposes to manipulate your professor because you're too cowardly to formulate your arguments properly. In chapter 11 of Beyond Order, this new book that you've been referring to, I tried to delineate out sources of tragedy and malevolence for that matter, but we can start with tragedy because you need a theory of tragedy, because otherwise you tend to blame simplistically. Okay, so we could walk through it very quickly. You just talked about one particular kind of tragedy, which is natural. It's like you can do everything right and nature can take you out at the knees, right?
Yep.
Okay, so that's one source of suffering in life, the natural world. Another source of suffering is the inadequacy of our social institutions. And a third source of tragedy is our inadequacy as individuals. And malevolence doesn't apply particularly to the natural world, although it can feel like that at times if someone you love is afflicted by some terrible disease, for example. And we tend to think of that as particularly malevolent when we admire the moral stature of the person so affected, right?
Correct.
But it's somewhat unfair to attribute malevolence to nature. It's more fair to attribute it to social structures. And it's more fair to attribute it to the darkness in our own souls. But you need to know, I think you need to have a sophisticated representation of tragedy and malevolence so that you don't fall prey to simplistic blaming. So human suffering is not caused by capitalism. That's wrong. Now you could say there are elements of human suffering that are exaggerated by excesses and defaults in capitalism. That's a different statement. That's not a black and white statement. It's a reasonable statement. You can progress from there. But you should say perhaps at the same time that for all its faults, this is the good that it's done, and it isn't obvious what system would work better. So now the question, I suppose part of the question is, why do we fall prey to more simplistic forms of reasoning? And some of that is Well, it's convenient. It's easy and convenient. It's easy because it's easier to think in black and white terms to just attribute malevolence. So, for example, if you believe that all human suffering is a consequence of capitalism, that solves a lot of problems for you. You know where malevolence is. You know what your moral duty is. You've simplified the world. You've taken a huge burden off your shoulders, and you certainly don't have to take on the moral requirement of participating in the system, and perhaps you don't want to, and God only knows why that might be. You want this more nuanced approach, and that was actually part of the purpose of a classical education. A humanities education was designed to give you a more nuanced view. That was its original purpose, although that's, sadly, I would say, gone by the wayside. It looks like it. I've had these conversations recently that have been quite interesting, they're very disturbing, actually. I talked to two of Canada's most outstanding people in the last 2 weeks, Conrad Black, who ran a huge newspaper empire, and Rex Murphy, who's probably Canada's best known journalist personality, because he's both. He's a great journalist, but he's a personality as well. And they remembered their university education. Jocko Willink as well. He's not a Canadian, but he had the same kind of memory. They talked about their education in the humanities, mostly concentrating on English literature, and described it with tremendous fondness as a turning point in their life, as an opening up of the world of knowledge to their youthful eyes, right? Very, very fondly. Contrasted that with Yeonmi Park, who is an escapee from North Korea, very brave woman who was then enslaved in China, had a life that was just sheer hell, and spent a good part of the interview telling me how much better her life was than the lives of many people she knew. She wrote a book called In Order to Live, but the book stopped at the year 2015, so I asked her what she did. She went to Columbia, took a humanities degree, which was a dream of hers. After finishing her entire education in 1 year, her education prior to university.
Cow.
Right, exactly. Then she went to a South Korean university for 3 years. They're hard to get into. And then she went to Columbia. I said, what was it like going to Columbia? Taking a humanities degree from this escapee from totalitarianism who was once enslaved, got to go to one of America's august institutions and be trained in the humanities. Someone who'd been exposed to George Orwell and who was motivated to write because she read Animal Farm, understood the power of literature. She said it was a complete waste of time and money, and that she was afraid to say anything.
Wow.
Yeah, wow. It's a hell of a thing to hear when you're a university professor. If someone has said rude things to you, for example, says a rude thing to you, maybe you shouldn't respond immediately, even though you're very irritated, because maybe that's just an impulsive response, and one that you'll regret, one you make in anger that you'll regret. And so I would say, when you're dealing with someone and you want to chastise them, then you should wait for them to sin 3 times, right? So the first time they're rude to you, you think, oh, well, they're probably having a bad day, or I misunderstood, or I'm rude sometimes too, and I'll just let it go. But you don't forget, and you don't pretend it didn't happen, and then it happens again, and you think, well, that could still be fluke, that could still be situational, so maybe I'll just hold my damn tongue, but I'll remember. And then the third time they do it, then you think, no, 3 times, that's a pattern. And so then you can go to them and you can say, look, this happened, and then maybe they deny it, and you say, well, yeah, you can deny it, but then this happened, and maybe they deny it, and you can say, well, you can deny that, but then this happened. And 3 times the charm. And that's a time when you should stand up for yourself and say what you have to say. Look, you have to put yourself in a position where you can say what you have to say. You have to think it through. You have to have a plan. And you can't just launch yourself off the edge of a cliff and hope that God's going to catch you on the way down. And it's definitely the case that if you have something to say, like if you're being oppressed at work, if you've got some, horrible tyrant as a boss, or maybe that's happening to you in your marriage, or maybe you're the horrible tyrant, God only knows. There's things that have to be said, but that doesn't mean you can just blurt them out. You have to have a plan. You have to figure out what you want to say. You have to make it as minimally troublesome as possible. You have to have the goal that you want in mind, And you have to have a backup plan. Like this, the sort of thing that you're talking about, where you need to say something. That's like a little war. You don't want to walk into that unarmed and unprepared. Now, that doesn't mean that that means that you should set up your life so that you're firmly enough anchored in a variety of different ways so that you can say what you need to say. The existentialists called it thrownness, which is that's a Heideggerian term. And thrownness is the fact that we kind of experience life as if we're tossed into it, thrown into it. You're male and not female. You're Hindu and not Christian. You're tall and not short. You have an arbitrary range of talents and an arbitrary range of limitations, none of which, in some sense, you chose. It's the cards you're dealt. Now, some of those are cards of privilege. Maybe you're born intelligent. Maybe you're born symmetrical. Maybe you're born healthy. Maybe you're born into a culture where it's much easier not to be absolutely deprived. Maybe your parents are rich. And so all of that, in some sense, is unearned. Now, along with that comes a good dose of existential guilt. Because at the same time, and this is true for anyone, regardless of their cultural background, the ground we walk on is soaked in the blood of historical atrocity. And so that's on you. Because, people think, well, who's the Nazi? Well, it's the fascist, or who's the radical communist? It's the radical left-wing ideologue. And the fundamental truth of the matter is that's best dealt with as a spiritual matter, is the adversary is within, really, most profoundly. And so you have to take the responsibility for that historical atrocity onto yourself. I was talking to Guy Ritchie this week about his movie King Arthur. It's quite an interesting movie in many ways. And when Arthur, who could be the hero, takes the sword, he's so overcome by visions of his murderous uncle that he can't pick up the weapon. Well, think about that. Now, you have weapons at your disposal, but they've been used by your murderous uncle. How dare you wield them? And the answer is, maybe it's easy just to leave the sword on the ground because you do want to be responsible for atrocities going forward. And don't think you couldn't be. And don't think you might not enjoy it. And so, the way you pay for your privilege is with your virtue. I mean that most particularly. You have these opportunities and this existential guilt. And the way you expiate that and atone is by doing your best to live the best possible life you can manage, to speak the truth, to treat people with respect, to abide by the principles of the dignity of the individual, and to put your house in order. And that's how you pay for your unearned privilege. All of us. And we all have our privileges and our curses, All of us have that. That's why it's not useful to be envious of people. You see you're a young man, you see someone drive by in a Ferrari with a blonde, and you think, my God, he's got everything. And, the woman in the car is a prostitute who's got a cocaine addiction, and her life is just one catastrophe after another. And he's had to lie and cheat his way into this position, and he's afraid that everything's going to come crashing down on him, and that's what you're jealous of. And it's just not that profound. You don't want someone else's fate. Man, your fate's enough, and your adventure's enough. It's plenty. It's more than you can ever fully realize. And so that's also part of the reason that we all believe that the individual has some intrinsic dignity. It's don't be so sure that your position and your room is so damn trivial. It might be your attitude towards it that's trivial. And if you're in dire straits and dire circumstances, just look at how much opportunity you have to make things better. We're built to walk uphill. And when you reach the pinnacle of the hill, you want to stop and appreciate the vision, but the next thing you want is a higher hill in the distance, because it's the uphill climb that it's from the uphill climb that we derive our value. And I mean this technically. So almost all the positive emotion we feel, especially the emotion that fills us with enthusiasm, and that's to be filled with the Spirit of God, by the way, because that's what enthusiasm means. That's experienced in relationship to a goal. And so in some sense, and this is part of the religious enterprise, you want a goal that you can never attain, right? So you can always move closer to the goal that recedes as you move towards it. You think, well, that's frustrating. It's like Sisyphus pushing the rock uphill. But it's not, because as you pursue that goal, you put yourself together and your life does get better and richer and more abundant. And that's why the highest levels of virtue and goal are in some sense transcendent. You want them to be above everything you're doing so you can continually move towards something that's more sublime and better. That's what you are. You're here to live, not to sleep. And the problem with the vision of Mai Tais on the beach is that, well, first of all, that's a vision of drug-induced unconsciousness. Second, it's only going to work for about a week. Third, you're going to be a laughingstock in a month and depressed and aimless and goalless. You want a horizon of ever expanding possibility. And so it does happen to people because they've staked their soul on the attainment of an instrumental goal. And it can be a pretty high order goal. It was in your case. But then you think, well, now I'm there. Now what? Well, the answer can't be, well, I'm going to live in the lap of luxury and never have to leave the face. What do you want to be? A giant infant with a gold bottle? You never have to do anything but lay in your back and suck. It's like, well, you see the problem with that as a conceptualization. It's no, you want to be like an active warrior moving uphill with your sword in hand, and that's dynamic, that's exciting, and that's why so many young men disappear into video games. That's all acted out in the video game. So they have to act that out in their own life.
We asked that question with good intentions. Are you happy? What's a better question for me to ask Jordan Peterson?
How are you doing?
How are you doing? How are you doing?
Brilliantly and terribly. You know, when you listen to a profound piece of music, one that sort of spans the whole emotional experience, it's not happy. Happy is elevator music, and probably you just shouldn't listen to that at all, right? And you think, why? Well, it's harmless, it's treacly, it's sweet, it's simple, it lacks depth, it's shallow, that's a problem. It doesn't have that deep sense of awe and horror, I would say, that is characteristic of the best of all music. You know, you listen to some simple music, so-called. Hank Williams is a good example. You know, the blues cowboy from the 50s who died of alcoholism when he was 27 and whose voice sounds like an 80-year-old man. Simple melody, you know, but there's nothing simple in the song and in the voice. It's deep, you know, it's like the blues. It's like black blues in the States from the 20s, and it was certainly influenced by that tradition. There's this admission of a deep suffering at the same time as you get the beautiful transcendence of the music. And that's meaning, you know, that's awful in the most fundamental sense, but you need an antidote to suffering, and it has to be deep. And you know, deep moves you tectonically, and it's not a trivial thing. But that's better than happiness. And maybe if you're lucky, while you're pursuing that and while you're immersed in it, you get to be happy, and you should fall on your knees and be grateful for that when it happens. You know, it's a gift. It really is a gift. And it comes upon you unexpectedly, your happiness, you know. But you aim to climb uphill to the highest peak you can possibly envision. And that's better than happiness.
Why did you include terribly?
Well, for example, now when I go, wherever I go in the world, people come up to me and they're usually, I wouldn't say they're happy to see me. They're often in tears, you know, and they often have a pretty rough story to relate. You know, they were suicidal or nihilistic or homicidal or trapped, desperate, you know, and they tell me that real fast. And then they say, I've overcome that to a large degree, and thank you for that. And you think, well, that's really something to have that happen over and over. In some ways, you might think, well, how could anything better possibly happen to you than to have people come up to you all over the world, strangers, and open themselves up like that, like they're old friends so quickly. But at the same time, it's an awful thing, because you see, even in the revelation of their triumph, the initial depth of their despair. So I wouldn't change that. But it's not nothing. It's certainly not just happiness. It's better than happiness, but it's almost unbearable.
You can say things to people like, tell the truth and be good. And those are cliches, obviously. And so they lack power because they're cliches, but you can take them apart and utilize them in a manner that stops being a cliche. And you do that by being more humble about them, I would say, because maybe you can't tell the truth because you don't know what the truth is. But one thing you can do is you can stop saying things that you know to be untrue. And you might say, well, how do I know that they're untrue? And the answer to that is, well, you need a whole philosophy of truth, the elaboration of an entire philosophy of truth to answer that question. And so we're not going to bother answering that question because in some sense at the moment it's beside the point. That isn't the issue. The issue is there are times in your life where you know that the thing that you're saying is not true. It's a deception, it's a lie of some sort, and you're using it to manipulate yourself or another person or the world. And you're also possessed, fully possessed of the idea that you can get away with it. And there's a satanic arrogance about that. In fact, that is the archetypal arrogance that's portrayed in the mythological character of Satan, because Satan is precisely the archetype of the element of the mind that believes that it can twist and bend the structure of reality without paying the price for that. And you can't imagine anything that's more arrogant than that, because really, do you really think that you can twist the structure of a reality and that that's going to work out for you without it snapping back? It's so obvious that that can't work, that everyone knows it. But anyways, back to the initial point, is that you know by the rules of the game that you yourself are playing, that some of the times you're violating the rules of the game that you're playing. And the first issue with regards to, say, stating the truth or behaving in a responsible manner would be merely stop cheating at whatever game it is that you've chosen to play. That's a good start, and that'll straighten out your life. It'll start to straighten out your life. And so, well, the flood, how does the flood tie into this? Well, you know, we live in a corrupt structure. We're corrupt as individuals. We live in a corrupt structure, and part of that corruption is just happenstance. It's the way things fall apart. But the other part of it is that not only are we not aiming up, we're actually aiming down. And the flood story is a warning, and it's a very clear warning. And the warning is, if you aim down enough, and then if enough of you aim down at the same time, everything will degenerate into something that's indistinguishable from the chaos from which things emerged at the beginning of time. It's something like that, because the cosmos that's presented in mythological representations is chaos versus order, right? The order is on top, you might say, and the chaos is always underneath. And the chaos can break through, or the order can crumble, and you can fall into the chaos, and that chaos is intermingled potential. And the way that you destroy the order and let the chaos rise back up, which is exactly how it's portrayed in the flood story, is by inhabiting the corpse of your father. That's one mythological motif, and feeding on the remains, and with no gratitude and no attempt to replenish what it is that you're taking from. And the warning in the flood story is, don't do that for very long, because things will happen that are so awful you cannot possibly imagine it. And that'll happen to you personally, and it'll happen to your family, and it'll happen to your community, and it's happened to people over and over throughout history. And it's quite interesting, you know, it's very soon after the story of Cain and Abel when you see evil enter the world in the story of Adam and Eve, along with self-consciousness. And evil there is the ability, that's the knowledge of good and evil, that's the ability to hurt other people self-consciously, to know what you're doing. And then of course instantly Cain takes that to the absolute extreme, and he uses that capacity to destroy really what he loves best. He gets as close as a human being can to destroying the divine ideal, because of course his brother is Abel, and Abel is favored by God, and Cain destroys him, which Cain tells God at the end of that episode that his punishment is more than he can bear. And I think the reason for that is, where are you once you destroy your own ideal? What's left for you? There's nowhere to go. There's no up. And when there's no up, there's a lot of down. And you know, there's an idea that was put forth very nicely in Milton's Paradise Lost, when he was describing from a psychological perspective essentially what hell is. And hell is, you're in hell to the degree that you're distant from the good. That might be a good way of thinking about it. And if you destroy your own ideal, which you do with jealousy and resentment and the desire to pull down people who you would like to be, let's say, then you end up in a situation that's indistinguishable from hell. And the way the story, the biblical story unfolds is, well, it's Cain, and then it's the flood. And so Cain adopts this mode of being that's antithetical to being itself, at least to positive being itself. He does it voluntarily, he does it knowing full well what he's doing. And the net consequence of this, that as it ripples through the entire social structure, is that God stands back and says, this whole thing has got so bad, the only thing we can do is wipe it to the ground. And that is no joke. That's exactly how things work. And one of the things that's extraordinarily terrifying about that sequence of stories, and I believe this to be true, I think I realized this independently of any of the analysis that I was doing of mythological stories, because I looked at what happened in places like the Soviet Union and Maoist China and in Nazi Germany, and the most penetrating observers of those societies, the people who were most interested in how it was that those absolute catastrophes came about, all said the same thing. It was rooted in the degeneration of the individuals who made up the society. You know, you hear, well, people were following orders. It's like, no, that explanation doesn't hold water. Or that you'd be punished if you resisted. Well, there was some truth in that, but nowhere near as much as people might think, especially at the beginnings of the process. More it was that people decided, each and every one of them, to turn a blind eye to the catastrophes and to participate in the lies. And that warped the entire societies, and they went as, you know, they veered their way downward to something as closely approximating hell as you could hope to manage, especially in places like Nazi Germany, and well, in all three of those places, in Maoist China and in the Soviet Union. And so the thing that's so frightening about, one of the things that's so frightening about the stories in Genesis is they say something very clear, which is that your moral degeneration contributes in no small way to the degeneration of the entire cosmos. And you say, well, I would like my life to be meaningful. People say that. Really, would you? Really? You really would like your life to be meaningful? You think maybe people would trade a little nihilism to not have to face that particular realization? And I think people do that all the time. It's a terrible weight to realize, but we are networked together that's the price of, or let's say that's the vulnerability that's associated with our intense capacity to communicate. And it is certainly possible that the ripples of our individual actions have consequences that are far beyond the limits of our immediate consciousness. And I also think people know that too. They know that in the way that people know things when they don't want to know them, which means they know them embodied, they can feel them, they can sense them, they have an emotional response to them, but there's no damn way they're going to let them become articulate because they don't want to know. And when you're feeling guilty and ashamed about the things you've done or not done, and I know that can get out of hand as well, it's often because there is a crooked little part of you that's aiming at the worst possible outcome. You know, one of the things Jung said about the shadow, you know, that Jung's famous idea that everyone has a dark side and that dark side needs to be incorporated and made conscious. Jung said that the shadow of the human being reaches all the way to hell. And he actually, that's the thing that's so interesting about reading Carl Jung, is he actually means what he says. It's not a metaphor. It's like the part of you that's twisted against being is aligned with the part of the cosmos, let's say, the conscious cosmos, that's aiming at making everything as terrible as it can possibly be. And it's a terrible shock to realize that. It's partly why people don't realize it. It's something that people keep at an arm's length. It's the same as recognizing yourself as a Nazi concentration camp guard, which is a very useful exercise, because there's absolutely no reason why you couldn't have been or still could be one. So, and if you think otherwise, then all the more reason for assuming that you would be unable to resist the temptation if it was in fact offered to you. And if you don't think it's a temptation, then there's so much that you don't know about human beings that you're not even in the game, because if it wasn't a temptation, then people bloody well wouldn't have done it. And plenty of people did it, and it's no wonder. There is this idea that your country is founded upon, for example, that each individual is of divine worth. And I made reference to this client I had when I was a junior therapist, and so even the most, what would you say, ignored and alienated, marginalized, let's say, to use a word that's been overused, have something of real value to bring into the world. And this is the case. You're a particularized creature as a son of God or a daughter of God, let's say. You have something to bring into the world that no one else can bring in. And so if you fail in that duty, then you deprive the world of that. And maybe you shouldn't do that. Like maybe everything's lesser if you do that. And you don't know how much lesser, because the world is also constituted in a very strange way. Dostoevsky said that we're not only responsible for what we do, but for what everyone else does, which is truly an insane thing to say, but also in some sense fundamentally true. I don't know how it is that each of us can bear the burden of the world on our shoulders singularly, because I can't really comprehend how things can be structured in that manner, but I do believe nonetheless that it is the case, and so that if you forswear your responsibility to the highest good, then you tear something out of the fabric of being that is of inestimable value. And I do believe you will pay for that if you do it. And I would suggest that you don't pay that price, because it will not be pleasant. That's definitely hell. And if you don't think hell is real, you haven't thought about it enough. It isn't a matter of other people believing foolish things. It's a matter of you being so naive and so well protected that you have no idea how the world is constituted. And so that's the temptations, let's say. Chaos and nihilism and hopelessness, or intellectual pretension and the desire for self-aggrandizement and narrow power. Don't do that. It's not helpful. It won't do you any good, and it's beneath you. It's beneath you to do that, and you that will manifest itself in your life. That subordination of what's highest in you to those lesser gods, let's say, that'll manifest itself in the torments of your own conscience, and no one escapes from that. And so. Don't do that. Don't make that choice at the crossroads. And you have another opportunity now to be the next iteration of yourself that you can be. At a crossroads, the metaphor works because you make a decision. You go one direction or another. And there's an old blues idea that you meet the devil at the crossroads. I always wondered why that was. I thought it through. It's a really compelling idea. It's an image that has a good narrative fit, and it sticks in your memory once you hear it. Why do you meet the devil at the crossroads at midnight? Maybe that's when you examine your conscience, or it examines you. And then you might ask, well, why do you meet the devil at the crossroads? And the answer is, most fundamentally, because when you come to a place in your life where you have to make a choice, and I think this is actually true of every choice we ever make, but it's more evident when the choice is more weighty, let's say, as the choices that lay themselves out now in front of you are weighty. You aim up or down. And there's always an agent of temptation at every choice point enticing you to aim down.
And I've thought a lot about what aiming down means, and so I'll run through that for a bit. The spirit of temptation, it manifests itself, for example, in the story of Cain and Abel. And so Cain falls prey to temptation, and God bluntly informs him when he complains about his fate that the temptation was freely chosen and that he could have done differently and better. And Cain becomes, this is in the aftermath of the improper sacrifices that he makes. The sacrifices that he makes that are not everything they could be, they're not in the service of the highest good, that are deceptive and arrogant simultaneously, because when we make improper sacrifices, we believe in the deepest part of ourselves that we've pulled one over God. And I suggest that that's a temptation you might want to avoid, that presumption. And then you might say, well, if you're tempted to aim down, you're tempted to make improper sacrifices, you're tempted to arrogantly presume that you are going to get away from it, with it, that you're not going to be called on it. What are the pathways down that might manifest themselves in front of you? And I think the two stories that follow the story of Cain and Abel detail that. So after Cain and Abel comes the flood. And that's no accident. The narrative placement of those stories is definitely no accident. It's unbelievably sophisticated from a literary perspective, a philosophical perspective, theological perspective, existential perspective. One form of temptation is the nihilistic chaos that's symbolically represented by the flood, right? It's the proliferation of sins. And sin is a word, both its Greek and its Hebrew derivation are related to archery. So the Greek derivation, I hope I haven't got this wrong, because I know there are Greek scholars in this audience. So the word is derived from the Greek word hamartia, which means to miss the mark, and it's an archery term. It's a lovely notion to know that, because to sin therefore means to miss the target, which implies that it has something to do with aim or the lack thereof. I love that. I think it's so apt. And the derivation of the word sin from the Hebrew source actually relies on the same imagery. And so to sin is to aim wrong or to miss the mark. And there's a variety of ways you can miss the mark, right? Don't aim at all. That's a good one. Assume there is no such thing as aim. Assume all aims are equal. Well, you sin, you miss the mark. What can happen? Well, one way is you can descend into a kind of nihilistic hopelessness. And that's not... You can understand that. You know, you meet people in life whose lives have been so hard. You know, you hear their stories. They've suffered so much, and they're bitter, and they're hurt, and they're resentful. And you think, oh my God, it's no wonder you're bitter and hurt and resentful. I mean, look what you've gone through. But you also notice that their bitterness and their resentment and their hopelessness and their chaos and their anxiety, it's not helping, right? It's worsening the problem. It's not making it better. And I'm not saying that people can always resist that. But I've certainly seen that it's not helpful. But I've also met other people, you know, who have had stories equally catastrophic, sometimes more catastrophic, sometimes so catastrophic you can't even believe that they survived, who are not embittered or made resentful by those experiences, and who continue to aim up. And so that makes a mockery of a kind of casual determinism, right? Is that you end up chaotic, nihilistic, hopeless, anxious, etc., merely as a consequence of the unbearable tragedy of your life. Because if that was the case, then everyone who had a series of unbearable tragedies, which, by the way, will be almost all of us in one way or another at one time or another, would end up in that catastrophic chaos that if manifested broadly enough in a society, produces a flood that ends everything. We have this idea, it's not a good idea, and it's certainly an idea for which religious people are often pilloried, that faith means the sacrifice of reason and the willingness to believe things that are patently not true. And when religious people debate scientists, they're often sort of hung out to dry on exactly those presuppositions, their willingness to accept on principle propositions that seem on the face of them impossible. I don't think that's what faith is at all in some fundamental sense. I think faith is a form of courage. You know, if you're hurt by life, and you will be, it's
understandable that you might react in a nihilistic and hopeless fashion and become anxious and depressed and cynical and bitter and all of that. That's a bad pathway. And I think part of what helps you through that is faith. And part of that faith is that it's incumbent upon you, and actually in your best interest and everyone else's, to maintain faith in the fundamental goodness of existence, including your own, despite the evidence to the contrary. Right? Because you can draw conclusions from suffering in two ways, right? One is that you have a duty and perhaps the capability to transcend the suffering and still serve the good, or you can derive the conclusion that life is so unbearable that it would be best terminated, which is the conclusion that Goethe as Mephistopheles derives, for example, in Faust. He says, well, the world is rife with suffering, and it's so unbearable that consciousness itself, all beings, should cease to exist. That would be better. Nothing is better than something if something is rife with suffering. And you can derive that conclusion, and you'll be driven to it in some of the farther reaches of your life when terrible things happen to you. But I would say faith is the courage to not take that path despite the evidence that that might be justified.